Hi everyone. Today we're going to quickly review the writing process. I realize that some of you might have been taught these principles before, but I thought it would be helpful to briefly review the major points of the writing process. Now, one of the reasons many students find writing for college courses so difficult is that they attempt to write papers in one sitting, often the night before the assignment is due. Now, I was a student for a very long time, and I understand why that happens. Students juggle so many responsibilities, and it's very tempting to put off work until the last minute because we have so much to do. But when it comes to writing, procrastination really does make the job harder, takes more time, and usually results in lower grades. But once we get into the habit of using a process to write papers, we find that it actually makes the job much easier and results in higher grades. One thing we need to keep in mind about the writing process is that it is actually recursive, meaning that we use the various components over and over again. They don't actually take place in a strictly linear fashion, even though we discuss them as if they do. I'll try to explain how that works as we proceed through this video. Prewriting is what English teachers call everything we do before we begin drafting our paper. But because prewriting is a term that also is used to refer to a set of very specific techniques that writers use to generate ideas, it's actually more accurate to refer to this entire set of steps as planning. But you might hear either term used, so it's a good idea to be familiar with both. Study the assignment. Now, this step might seem silly to even mention, but it is important. Most professors will provide students with some written information about a writing assignment. Now, in some cases, it might be a simple statement in the syllabus stating that a paper is required. In others, such as in this course, the writing assignment sheet might provide extensive details on what is expected. Now, if a professor believes a certain aspect of the assignment is important enough to discuss it in writing, chances are that it is an aspect that will affect your grade. So study the assignment sheet thoroughly and make note of important points in the assignment sheet. What limits are placed on the topic? What is expected in terms of sources or research? What are the minimum and maximum paper lengths? Now, although length is not necessarily the most important aspect of a paper, it is important because it provides information about what the professor expects in terms of focus and development. Also, some professors are very picky about length. I've worked with professors who gave papers that were even one line shorter than the minimum length requirement of 0. Make sure you always write at least a line or two more than the absolute minimum required, just in case the professor is really picky about it. Now, as you're going through the assignment sheet, it's a good idea to make initial contact with your professor about the assignment. Make sure that you have a clear understanding of expectations. It's often good to take just a couple of minutes to discuss the assignment with the professor as soon as you can. It clarifies information, and it also demonstrates that you have begun thinking about the assignment and are dedicated to doing a good job. Now, students don't seem to understand this, but professors actually like it when students ask us questions, and we're impressed when students take the time to do so. In writing a paper, it's almost impossible to talk to a prof too often about a paper assignment. We really do want to help. Now, it's important to keep in mind that prewriting is also valuable for writers beyond college, too. One of the most frustrating situations we face as writers is sitting down to write and having no idea where to start. That blinking cursor seems to mock us for not being able to get started, and the longer we sit there and watch it blink, the worse it gets. I know that I faced many times when I got so sick of watching that cursor blink that I wanted to throw my computer out the window just to get that cursor out of my face. But a little planning prevents that frustration and helps us reduce the stress of writing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, prewriting is a term that is used to refer to specific techniques that writers use to generate ideas. We're going to review those techniques shortly, but they include things like brainstorming, prewriting, listing and grouping, and mind mapping. One thing to keep in mind about prewriting is that there is really no right or wrong way to do it. Anything that helps you generate ideas is great. You might find that one specific technique always works best for you, or you might find that different techniques work best for you in different situations. But keep in mind that the entire point of prewriting is generating ideas. As we prewrite, we don't make judgments about whether ideas are good or bad, and we certainly don't pay any attention to things like grammar, wording, and spelling. The point is to get as many ideas as we can down on paper, and then we go back and decide which ideas are worth considering and which should be ignored. Now, as I said, the writing process is recursive. Yes, these prewriting techniques are useful when we're just getting started, but we can use them if we get stuck while we're drafting our paper or if we need to generate ideas for ways to revise. These techniques are very useful tools that we can and should pull out and use whenever we get stuck. Most papers you will write in college, including some of the papers we will write for this course, require research, and research is an important part of planning. First, go back and review the assignment sheet for research requirements. Does the assignment sheet specify a particular number of required sources? Are there restrictions on the types of sources you can use? Next, of course, you must find the research materials and determine how to use them. We will spend some time discussing research methods later in the semester. Now, this is another good time to check in with your prof. Try to arrange to meet with him or her to go over the sources you've located. There's a good chance that the prof might tell you about other sources you can use. In some cases, the prof might actually loan you books or give you copies of articles. You'd be surprised how much help you can get on a paper if you take the time to talk to the prof about it often. Again, the writing process is recursive. You might find as you draft or revise that your paper creates questions that you can't answer, or that you might need to develop a particular section of the paper more completely. You may need to go back and conduct additional research as you draft or revise. As we've discussed, outlining is an important part of planning. In some courses, you might be required to submit a formal outline. But even when that isn't required, it's very helpful if you produce a scratch outline for yourself. In this course, you will be required to submit scratch outlines, and each outline must meet specific requirements. But if you write scratch outlines you don't need to submit, they can be as simple as a list of abbreviations that remind you what you think you want to cover in your paper in the order that you think you want to discuss the material. Always keep in mind that the scratch outline is just a working document. You can change anything about your organization if you find you need to. But having a scratch outline can go a long way toward preventing those frustrating cases in which you don't know what to say next. Drafting is simply the process of getting your paper written out. Where most students make mistakes is in assuming that drafting is the only step of the writing process. It isn't. The very first draft of any writing project is called the zero draft. It's called that because it doesn't actually count as a piece of writing. Sadly, many students submit the zero draft as the finished paper, which explains why students tend to earn poor grades on writing assignments. The point of the zero draft is to get the information written out in a fairly rough form so that you can work to turn it into a finished paper. When writing the zero draft, you want to pay attention to focusing on the topic, developing each idea, and organizing the information as well as you can. If you find you get stuck and don't know what you should write next while working on the zero draft, you should use one of the pre-writing techniques to help you generate ideas. Now, you don't need to worry at this point about things like wording, grammar, format, documentation, spelling, or anything other than getting the information somewhat organized and written down so you can work with it. While most steps of the writing process can be completed over several sessions that can be as short as 5 minutes long, it's best to write the zero draft in one sitting, unless, of course, the paper is like over 50 pages long. Remember, the idea of writing a zero draft is produce a piece of writing to begin working with it. It's basically just a rough map to guide us through producing a finished paper through revising. Since it is a map, it generally works better if we can get the initial zero draft written in one sitting so that we can produce a map that moves in a particular direction. Now, since the advent of word processing, it is somewhat natural for us to do some revising even as we write our zero drafts. The division between one draft and another is much less distinct using word processing. But no matter how much we revise as we write our very first draft, it is not a finished product, and it should never be submitted as a finished paper. Students submit zero drafts as finished papers in this course fairly frequently, and in some cases, it's easy to spot. If a draft has numerous strings of letters that are not words, numerous simple words that are misspelled, or numerous instances of problems that could have been caught if the student even read the paper before turning it in, I can tell the paper is a zero draft. Now keep in mind that initial submission drafts for this course must be completed papers, and zero drafts are not completed papers. If you submit what is clearly a zero draft as an initial submission draft, it will earn a 0, and that paper cannot be included in portfolio. After writing a zero draft, it is important to set it aside for at least 24 hours and then begin revising it. The reason we need to take a lengthy break between producing a zero draft and beginning revision is because we need to be able to look at the piece with fresh eyes. The word revision is revision. In other words, re-seeing. When we have spent the better part of the day writing our zero draft, it becomes very difficult to tell what is actually there as opposed to what was once in the draft that we have deleted at some point. I know that sounds silly, but believe me, it happens quite frequently. Our brains need some time to kind of reset so that we can actually see what's in front of us. Revising is, in many ways, the most important step in the writing process. It has been said that there is no such thing as good writing. There is only good rewriting. Professional writers revise extensively. After winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, John Steinbeck wrote a novel called East of Eden. He kept notes on his writing process, and he did complete revisions of this 600-page book 23 times. If a Nobel Prize-winning author benefits from multiple revisions, you and I certainly do. Global revision should be done first. Global revision is revising drafts for focus, development, and organization. First, we address focus by going through the paper and making sure that every sentence in it helps to develop our main idea, which is called our thesis. We delete any sentences that deal with information that is off the topic. Then we go through each section of the paper and make sure that each idea is developed sufficiently and doesn't raise any questions in our reader's mind. We might find that we need to use some pre-writing techniques to generate material to address questions that arise. Then finally, we revise organization. Now, most types of writing follow a particular organizational style, and we will study some of those organizational schemes this semester. So one of the things we check is that we're using the appropriate organizational scheme and that we're using it correctly. In revising for organization, it's also important to make sure that the organization is easy for readers to follow by making sure that it's logical and that every paragraph is connected to the one before it by the use of good transitions. We also make sure that every sentence is clearly connected to the one before it and after it. Now, it's not always possible to complete global revision in one sitting. In fact, revision works best if we take frequent breaks so that we can re-see what we're revising. One of the advantages of portfolio grading is that you will be able to work on revisions of papers numerous times before the portfolio is due at the end of the semester, providing you make the effort. And you can send as many revisions to me for comments as you like. But it's important to spend time revising before you submit the initial submission draft, too. Those draft grades do affect your course grade. In addition, if you turn in drafts that include errors you could avoid by simple revision, your return draft will be filled with comments that you don't really need, and that will make it more difficult to locate tips that could actually help you learn by providing comments about material you don't understand. It just wastes more of your time than necessary and makes learning more difficult. Make sure to revise your initial submission drafts carefully before submitting them. Local revision, which is also called proofreading or editing, is the last step of the writing process, and it is important. This is when we focus on the more detailed aspects of writing, such as wording, grammar, format, style, and documentation. Now, we tend to revise these aspects as we go to some degree, but it's important to always go through the completed paper at least one final time to make sure that our wording, grammar, format, style, and documentation are as close to perfect as we can make them. Yes, it all matters in all cases. You can't assume that a teacher in a course outside the English department won't deduct points for grammatical errors. The reason you are required to take writing courses is, in part, to make sure that you know how to avoid important grammatical errors. And you certainly must assume that any course that requires research papers is going to pay careful attention to how you document those sources. It's also very important at this point to go through the paper assignment again and make sure that your paper aligns with the requirements in the paper assignment sheet perfectly. As I said, if a professor believes that an aspect of writing is important enough that he or she takes the time to write it out, it probably will affect your grade. So part of local revision is making sure that your paper meets the specifications on your writing assignment perfectly. And again, don't forget that our pre-writing techniques can be useful. If we find that we need to reword a particular section, for example, it's often useful to brainstorm a number of different approaches to wording to determine which one works best. Remember throughout the entire process that the writing process is recursive. We use techniques from each step of the process as we work through other steps. As we've seen, We revise our pre-writing to determine which ideas we generated are good to consider. We use the pre-writing techniques to generate ideas as we draft, and we must revise to move beyond the zero draft. And then we use pre-writing techniques and draft new paragraphs as we have to as we revise. That's what we mean when we say that it's recursive. That's all we're going to cover in reviewing the writing process. We'll be discussing how to proceed with each aspect of the process throughout the semester, but this video reviews the basic process and emphasizes the importance of using the entire process instead of attempting to write a paper in one sitting the night before it's due. That might have worked okay for you in high school, but I can guarantee that it won't result in good grades on college papers, including the papers required in this course. If you have any questions about the information in this video or about anything connected to the course, I urge you to email me through Canvas. I truly do want to help you, but you need to let me know what I need to clarify for you. I hope this video does help you, and I look forward to working with you on developing a good writing process.